on that plan, and therefore—
Mr. Secretary, this happened on your watch. Listen, here's the problem. Every time before you come before this committee, you always say it's going to get better. Our plan is going to work at some future point, and you also usually say it's really not as bad as it looks.
Senator Hawley, you are recognized for your question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all the witnesses for being here. Mr. Secretary, Secretary Mayorkas, let me start with you. I want to ask you about the continued uncontrolled illegal immigration into the country, which I think is a very serious threat to the homeland. In July, I asked you about the migrant surge that's been occurring on your watch, and you said this, I'm quoting you now: "We have a plan. We are executing the plan. The plan takes time to execute, and we are doing so." Now, since that time, CBP has released data that showed 2 straight months of illegal border encounters above 200,000, which, as you know, hasn't happened in decades. My question is, when is your plan going to work?
So, in fact, we are implementing the plan, Senator Hawley, and I can walk through some of the measures that we have taken.
My question is, when is it going to work?
So it is, in fact, working. We have seen over the last several weeks, if not the month, a drop in the number of encounters at the United States border. We have been working very closely with Mexico to increase interdictions. We have addressed the issue of recidivism, and if, in fact, people have been previously removed, we are referring them to criminal prosecution. We have increased lateral flights across the border to facilitate the expulsion of individuals under Title 42.
I don't mean to interrupt you, Mr. Secretary. It's our time is so limited. I just want to be sure that I understand. 200,000 border encounters over 2 straight months, a record in decades, for over decades. And you're telling me that this is success? Are you happy with what's happening at the border now? Is this success?
Senator, as I said then and I say now, we have a plan. We're executing on our plan, and we will continue to do so.
But you just testified that it's working. I'm just trying to understand. Is this success? Are you telling me that this is successful? Your plan is successful currently?
Senator, we are not finished in the execution of our plan, and I never suggested otherwise. We continue to do the work that we are required to do to secure our border. That is an ongoing process, and indeed we are executing it.
Are you happy with your progress?
Senator, we need to do better, and we need to do more, and we are committed to doing so, and we are doing so.
Let me ask you about one of the latest crises that we've seen in Del Rio. Thousands of migrants crossing the border illegally. Reporters have captured images of this. Many are now encamped, as you know, on the U.S. side of the border. How many migrants have crossed into the United States in Del Rio over the past week?
So last week, I think the high point was 13 to 15,000. It is now well below 10,000. We continue to move individuals from Del Rio to other processing centers to facilitate their repatriation.
And how
increased, if I may, Senator, we have increased the number of repatriation flights to Haiti and to other third countries. The size of the population in Del Rio, Texas, has diminished considerably. And let me say 2 very important things which I observed firsthand in Del Rio, Texas yesterday. Number 1 is the human tragedy, just the vulnerability of the individuals who are under the bridge in Del Rio. We cannot minimize that. It is an extraordinarily difficult thing to see. Number 2, I met with quite a number of Border Patrol agents and officers in Del Rio, Texas. I saw them working with members of the Department of Health and Human Services to deliver medical attention. I saw them working with the American Red Cross to deliver medical kits.
How many are currently I'm sorry, Mr. Secretary, but we've got very limited time. How many are currently right now at the encampment?
I'd have to check as to today's numbers. It is below 10,000 is the latest information I have.
I just want to go back to your statement earlier to me that you have a plan and that it's working. Is 13 to 15,000 people crossing into the United States just last week? Is that working?
So, Senator, if you take a look at the situation, the discrete situation in Del Rio, Texas, one will view it differently than other challenges along the southern border. That was a very rapid, if I may, Senator, that was a very rapid increase. Really unprecedented increase in the number of individuals, primarily Haitian nationals, crossing in one discrete part of the border. And what we did there is we developed a plan and we are executing on that plan, and therefore,
Mr. Secretary, this happened on your watch. Listen, here's the problem. Every time before you come before this committee, you always say it's going to get better. Our plan is going to work at some future point. And you also usually say it's really not as bad as it looks. And then every time you leave, it gets worse and worse. This is a humanitarian crisis in Del Rio. You can spin it whichever way that you want. But you're quite right. We should not minimize the humanitarian conditions for which, frankly, you're responsible. You and your administration are responsible. Tens of thousands of people living in conditions that are startling, brought here because of your policies. Let me give you an example. The Washington Post reported on Sunday that one Haitian woman said that she and her family decided to travel from Chile, where she was residing, to Del Rio because they heard, and I quote, President Biden was letting people in. And of course, you've offered this temporary protected status to Haitians illegally residing in the United States starting in May. Then you halted deportation flights earlier this summer. Don't you think that you bear responsibility for this latest crisis?
Senator, let me speak to a number of the things that you have said. Number one, temporary protected status was in fact extended to Haitian nationals resident in the United States before July 29th. Individuals who arrive after July 29th are not eligible for temporary protected status. That is a provision of the law that we execute based on the circumstances that are contemplated in the legislation.
Mr. Secretary, my time has almost expired. I just want an answer. Do you bear responsibility for the crisis in Del Rio?
Second, Senator.
Does that mean you're not going to answer me?
I am answering if you'd give me the opportunity.
That's a yes or a no question. Do you bear responsibility for the crisis in Del Rio? Yes or no?
Senator, the smuggling organizations.
Yes or no, Mr. Secretary? Do you bear responsibility for the humanitarian crisis in Del Rio? Yes or no?
Senator, it is my responsibility to address the human tragedy in Del Rio, to address that, and we are doing so. That is my responsibility, and we are executing it as the Department of Homeland.
But you don't think you've played any role, and your policies have played any role in fostering and fomenting this crisis that has ensnared so many thousands of people?
Senator, what we are learning from our interviews with individuals is they are receiving false information and misinformation from the smuggling organizations that traffic in the exploitation of vulnerable individuals.
Well, so in other words, it's someone else's fault. All I can say is, Mr. Secretary, is that sooner or later, this administration is going to have to take responsibility for the crisis that you have fomented at the border that gets worse day upon day. And so far, every time we hear from you, it's somebody else's fault. Something's going to happen later. It's quite unbelievable. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Paul, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you. Director Wray, when Orwell first wrote 1984, people were concerned about that dystopian future, what it might mean. Big Brother invaded our privacy, our homes, our communications. But defenders of privacy took some consolation in the fact that the technology didn't exist for two-way TVs, and so much of it seems so futuristic. Now U.S. intelligence agencies have the ability to record and listen to every phone call in the world. We've sometimes collected phone calls from an entire country for an entire month at a time. We even have done it here at home in America. For years, the NSA collected millions of Americans' data without first having an individualized warrant. James Clapper notoriously lied, as we all know, to Congress about this massive surveillance program. He's now paid to deliver highly partisan rhetoric on a left-wing news outlet. Many in the FBI have been accused of bias. Some have been convicted. Some have been let go. McCabe, Klein Smith, Peter Strzok, Lisa Page. So it's kind of hard to argue that somehow we can get people in the FBI that are above bias. It seems to be something that goes with the territory. Maybe it was a bad spate of time where we had a whole bunch of them all at once, but it's a problem. When we investigate a presidential campaign, I think it's important that we realize the potential for bias that exists in the people bringing an investigation forward, but also incredibly important that we should devolve or at least consider using the Constitution and not using warrants that are used on foreigners. So we have two different standards. We have a constitutional standard, which is typically used for Americans, where we use the Fourth Amendment. And the Fourth Amendment says you have to have probable cause, of a crime. The FISA court standard is not a Fourth Amendment. It's an extra constitutional standard. It's less than the Constitution. It's probable cause of being associated with a foreign government. The problem is that when we have presidential candidates, they're all going to have foreign policy advisors. Most of them will have longstanding history in either government of some sort. They'll have people who do talk to foreigners all of the time. So you can see how someone with bias, and I think that's what happened during the investigation that turned out to be untrue on the Russia collusion. So we had a massive investigation of a presidential campaign. And I don't think enough of us have stepped back to say, well, my goodness, should we be using FISA warrants for the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court? Should we be using that kind of warrant on an American, particularly an American running for office who has all of these contacts? Do you think it's appropriate that we use FISA court warrants to investigate presidential campaigns?
What I do think is appropriate is that we use FISA warrants to investigate counterintelligence threats to the United States, as long as it's done consistent with the minimization and querying procedures that are carefully approved.
You don't think there was any problem with this investigation with the Crossfire Hurricane? You think it was all completely appropriate? Nobody in the chain of command was biased, and it just occurred because they were curious? We just indicted one of the Clinton lawyers yesterday for lying to you guys. You guys took it hook, line, and sinker and said, oh, well, we'll just investigate a major presidential candidate. Of course there's a huge problem. And if you don't see that there's a problem and that we need more controls on this and that we need to somehow obey the Constitution, I would say the same for President Biden. I would say the same for a president of any party. What a crazy upturned world where there would be, the bias is there. There's no way to get it. The reason we have checks and balances with the judiciary is so we can kind of get over the potential bias that occurs in the FBI or the CIA or anywhere else. If you don't have to go to a court and you go to a court that doesn't obey the Constitution, that's held in secret, that's not justice, and it's going to be rife for abuse. You don't agree with that?
There are parts of what you said that I'd like to weigh in on. So first, as to what happened in the so-called Crossfire Hurricane matter, I would say to you today, and I have said publicly on a number of occasions, that what that Inspector General report describes by certain FBI personnel, I consider to be unacceptable and unrepresentative of the FBI that I see every day, having joined in 2017, and not something that I think can ever happen again. So I want to make sure that you and I are talking not past each other on that. Now, second, I've put in place over 40 corrective measures, everything the Inspector General has recommended, and then some, to make sure that what happened there does not happen again.
I think that's admirable, and I appreciate that point of view. But, when Hamilton wrote that if men were angels, we wouldn't need the Constitution, we still are relying on angels working at the FBI. We're relying on you saying we're going to get a better set of people. We're not going to have that bias anymore. I think that's admirable. That's what I would want in someone being the director. But what we need is something beyond that, and this is what our founding fathers did when they set up the Fourth Amendment, is we had a Constitution, and we had the Fourth Amendment, an incredibly important amendment, and then we had a judicial system. The FISA court doesn't obey the Fourth Amendment. It has a less than constitutional standard. It allows you to have warrants without obeying the Fourth Amendment. And people don't realize this. You use FISA warrants that do not obey the Fourth Amendment. You have a lower standard for going after foreigners. I'm actually okay with that. If you're not a U.S. citizen and you're investigating someone overseas and you're eavesdropping on them, I'm actually fine with the FISA standard. But I'm not fine with the FISA standard for Americans, particularly Americans who are running for office, particularly for the person running for the highest office who is interconnected with all kinds of countries and always will be. And once you get biased people, once there's not perfection, and we get biased people in the FBI, the problem is the system can be abused. I think the only fix, it's admirable to have some regulations and some checks and balances you put in place, but the only real fix would be we should obey the Constitution. I don't think Americans nor political candidates should be investigated using a foreign intelligence surveillance court.
Thank you, Senator, for your kind words about the corrective measures we've put in place. I would say to you that I believe the FISA court operates within the Constitution, so we might have a difference of opinion in how we characterize it. I would also say to you that as we sit here 20 years after 9/11, and as somebody who was in FBI headquarters on the day of those attacks and saw the immediate aftermath, as we started to reverse engineer what went wrong on 9/11, much has been discussed back in those years about the so-called wall that was built up between law enforcement and intelligence. And a lot of the reforms that have occurred thanks to this Congress, thanks to the courts, thanks to the executive branch, to make sure that there is not a wall between the information sharing that has to occur, has been part of what's kept Americans safe since then. So I would want, of course, to work with you on any ideas that you have, but also to make sure that we don't rebuild the wall that made us all less safe and cost 3,000 innocent lives on the day of those attacks.
I
Thank you.
appreciate your opinion on the FISA court having the same standard as the Constitution. They don't. The Fourth Amendment says you have to have probable cause that someone has committed a crime or is committing a crime. It's a much different standard. The FISA court standard is probable cause that you have a relationship with a foreign government. It's a much lower standard, much more open to abuse, and you don't have a public court or judges which might protect the rights of an individual. If what happened in Crossfire Hurricane is allowed to stand and would allow the FBI to do this again, we can see a time when the intelligence agencies can completely take over our political process. It's a very dangerous thing, and I think most people got caught up in the partisanship of the time, whether they liked or disliked President Trump. And instead of really thinking about this, there still is a problem. To my mind, we need to reform the FISA system, and we should not use FISA warrants on Americans. It should be reserved because it's a lower constitutional standard, should be reserved for foreigners.
Senator Johnson.
Secretary Mayorkas, I'm putting a chart that I've been keeping on apprehension southwest border. Just to give you some quick numbers here. To date, this calendar year, there have been almost 1.3 million apprehensions. We are averaging, the last 2 months, 6,700 to 6,800 people per day. That's a large caravan per day being apprehended by Border Patrol. 8 to 1,100 known gotaways, which would equate somewhere over 300,000 gotaways, known gotaways for the year. If you annualize these figures, been a couple 100,000 people per month. We'll be up to about 2.1 million apprehensions. Add the getaways, 300,000 to 400,000. We're up to 2.5 million people. You have repeatedly stated that our borders are not open, that they're closed. Do you honestly believe that our borders are closed?
Senator, I do. And let me speak to that. We have
let me ask you a couple questions here. This committee received, it was dated September 11th, but apparently this letter was not received till Thursday. I didn't find out about it till yesterday. I released it to the public immediately. By recently retired U.S. Border Patrol Chief Rodney Scott. In this letter, former Chief Scott states, he is sickened by the avoidable and rapid disintegration of what was arguably the most effective border security in our nation's history. And of course, the chart shows it. We'd pretty well secured the border. We'd stopped the flow of unaccompanied children. We'd stopped the flow of family units because of the migrant protection protocols, the agreements that President Trump put in place, the building of the wall. We were serious about border security until your administration took office. You stood before this committee and said that you would enforce the laws. You have not done that. Let me go on. Chief Scott says, to think that well-resourced terrorist networks, criminal organizations, and hostile nations are not going to do the same, in other words, exploit the open border, is naive. Here's what's very troubling. He said the Secretary and other political appointees within DHS have provided factually incorrect information to congressional representatives and to the American public. So let me ask you, Mr. Secretary, of the 1.3 million people that we've apprehended, how many people have been returned, how many people are being detained, and how many people have been dispersed? And I want some numbers here. So we've got, again, 1.3 million people. How many people have been returned? How many people are being detained? How many people have been dispersed to all points around America?
Senator, I would be pleased to provide you with that data.
I want them now. Why don't you have that information now?
Senator, I do not have that data.
Why not?
For me.
Why don't you have that basic information?
Senator, I want to be accurate in the information.
I'm looking for ballpark figures. Is it about half? Have we dispersed about half of that? Are we up to about 600,000 people we dispersed?
Senator, these are the tools that we employ. We use the Title 42 authority, that is the public health authority empowered by the Centers for Disease Control to expel individuals in light of the
So I'm hearing that you're not using that to the full extent, and that we've got 50% of people, even apprehended under Title 42, that are not being returned. Is that accurate?
That is actually inaccurate.
Okay, so what is the, okay, so if you're saying that's
Senator,
inaccurate,
would you care to
what's
let
real
the
figure?
witness finish an answer?
I
actually want answers to my questions. What is the real figure then?
If I may say, Senator, we use the Title 42 authority, the public health authority of the Centers for Disease Control to the fullest extent we are able to.
So what is the percent that you are returning under Title 42? It's about 750,000 people apprehended under Title 42. How many of those individuals have been returned under Title 42?
Senator, I will provide that data to you.
So you're saying that 40 to 50% is not accurate. If you know that that's not accurate, you must have the real number.
Senator, what I said was not accurate was your assertion that we are not using Title 42 authority to the fullest extent that we
No, that's not what I said at all. I said we're not returning everybody under Title 42. We're dispersing a number of those individuals.
Senator, we are not doing that, not for reasons of our limitation of use that we impose on ourselves, but rather because certain of our capacity to return people under Title 42 is constrained by the Mexican authorities' ability to receive them. This is a matter of bilateral and multilateral relationships. We exercise the Title 42 authority to the fullest extent that we can. We then work with Mexico to assess what its capacity to receive individuals is.
Okay, again, you're talking about the process. I want numbers. I'm going to expect numbers. By the way, in our last hearing, which you didn't stick around for a second round of questions, you didn't come in here in person, I sent you questions for the record. I've got no response whatsoever. And you came before this committee, and you committed to responding to congressional oversight, and you have not done so. And according to former Chief Scott, you've provided factually incorrect information to Congress. So we're expecting you to up your game as it relates to congressional oversight. Let me quick switch to Afghanistan. We had a briefing yesterday morning, telephone briefing, and one of the assertions is that of the 124,000 Afghans that were evacuated out of Afghanistan, the majority, I can't remember, like the vast majority, or almost all, worked for some government agency, the military, whatever. I asked the question, how do you know that? I didn't get an answer. I've also talked to the commanding general and the people on the ground at Fort McCoy that have about 13,000 of these Afghans in their custody right now in Toma, Wisconsin, or Sparta, Wisconsin. I continue to ask. I understand the screening. They were screening against the terrorist watch list and the no-fly list, that type of thing. So I understand how if for example, an ISIS fighter or al-Qaeda terrorist, if they just happen to be on one of those watch lists, if we have a match, we're going to keep them out of the country. What are we doing to positively identify people, to connect them to these agencies or the members of the military that they did have connection with, so we have positive ID before we disperse? Because let's face it, 124,000 people, we got 700,000 SIVs, we got about 6,000 U.S. citizens. That leaves 117,000 people. We don't know who they are. How do we know who they are positively, not just in terms of derogatory information?
So not only do we vet individuals against our intelligence databases, but we also vet them against the Department of Defense databases. We capture their biographic and biometric information in the transit countries before they are allowed to board flights to the United States. We have expert screeners and vetters whom we have deployed to those transit countries so that they can use their expertise in addition to the information that we have captured biometrically and biographically before they board the flights.
Many don't even have
The
IDs.
senator's time has expired.